Traditional guardrails eroded quickly during the Trump administration's first year, with ethics bodies sidelined and inspector generals forced out, while DOGE tested the limits of its authority. The result was a federal landscape with fewer protections and less capacity, just as major decisions were being made. To dig into what that means for rebuilding, I'm joined by Faith Williams of the Project on Government Oversight. Faith, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with your recent testimony to members of Congress because you paint a really stark picture of how the Trump administration's first year reshaped government. When you think about it in totality, what stands out to you as maybe the most significant changes in this period?
Terry, it's a great question, and it's hard to answer it concisely. As you mentioned, I spoke before the Democrats on the House Oversight Committee, and it was co-hosted by members of Congress from areas with large numbers of federal workers in their districts. And since it was technically a shadow hearing, I use air quotes when I say the word testimony, but in essence, it felt just like a regular testimony where you talk to members of the Hill. So the biggest takeaway that I wanted to impress upon the members present that day was that the reshaping has been done, if not with its explicit aim, but certainly with one of its outcomes of increased corruption. Certain people in government are getting rich off of the way that the government has been reshaped and reformed in the last year, and doing so ultimately undercuts public trust in government. So that's really what I wanted to get across, that there are winners and losers in this last year, but ultimately we all lose because the American public is losing trust in their government.
You made the point that the reshaping of the federal workforce seems to have been without any particular intent or strategy. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so it seems as though the one strategy, if we can even call it that was used to cut the civil service was like a keyword search for diversity, equity, inclusion, the word woke, heaven forfend. And we saw how haphazard it was because there are countless examples of layoffs that happened that then would be kind of clawed back. So for example, we read many months ago about like nuclear safety employees being fired en masse, and then the scramble to rehire nuclear safety employees because it's actually a good idea to have them in your government. We saw similar things, a similar story with people that worked in the public health space who were supposed to help prevent or keep an eye on the next pandemic, whatever that may be. They were fired and then clawed back. And there was this pattern of massive layoffs, massive cuts, massive changes done by or directed by largely people that didn't really understand the function of their agency, that department, what those workers actually did. So, right, there was no fine-tooth comb approach here. There was no strategy, in my opinion.
And Faith, you also described DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that acted like an agency when it wanted authority and a White House office when it wanted to avoid oversight. How did that shape the broader pattern that you documented?
Oh, well, it is much easier to dismantle the government and make money off of dismantling the government when it's hard to perform oversight. So DOGE, and even as I say the word DOGE, there's been countless at this point articles and conversations. What is it? What was it? What is it now? What was it then? All of that. But essentially, DOGE, when it was challenged really with numerous different lawsuits, kind of showed up to each lawsuit a little bit differently. In one lawsuit, it was like, I can do all these things. I am powerful. I am just like an agency. And then in a different lawsuit, it would say, well, I'm a presidential office, so I don't have to share my records. You can't ask me those questions. I don't have to provide you with that information. And so it just played every side, essentially. And one of the first things that the administration did that I think helped usher in the bigger, broader changes made by DOGE and the administration together was decimating our system of independent oversight. So it is not a coincidence that one of the very first things to happen last January was the mass firing of a slew of inspectors general. It is not a coincidence that the Office of Government Ethics was impacted. And it is not a coincidence that the Office of Special Counsel was impacted. It's not a coincidence that the Department of Justice has excised nearly all of its people that worked on public corruption. Like, none of these things happened by happenstance. They happened early in the administration so that when then bigger changes occurred, there was way fewer people whose job it was to investigate those changes. So it's sort of ironic because I just said that there wasn't really a strategy to the mass civil service cuts. And I think that's right. But I do think there was a strategy when it came to cutting oversight.
I'm speaking with Faith Williams. She's director of the Effective and Accountable Government Program at the Project on Government Oversight. Faith, let's take that one more step. Now that all of those IGs have been fired, that special counsel's office is in question, many of the ethics bodies are sidelined, how do we get accountability?
It's a great question. And I think here we are feeling a massive absence of congressional oversight. I think it is interesting that the testimony I gave was before a shadow committee, because the questions that it asked on the face, what is our government like 1 year into a massive effort to reshape it, feels like one that both Republicans and Democrats would want to know the answer to. We are missing that oversight. There are DOGE subcommittees, on the House, in the House and in the Senate, that haven't circled back to say, well, what does it look like a year in? Okay, so DOGE is done, fine, but what does this agency do now? What's different? What are we doing better? What are we doing worse? None of those questions are happening, and so I think a big piece of it is Congress abdicating some of its oversight duties, and there's a remedy for this. I mean, I think in addition to congressional oversight, like hearings and letters, which are incredibly important, there are ways that Congress can use its constitutional powers to compel a little bit more transparency and information from the executive branch. There are appropriations bills that need to pass. There are nominations that need to be confirmed. It's especially timely this week. There could be war power declarations that must be, voted on. Like, there are moments when Congress can claw back a little bit more power, and it doesn't particularly seem interested in doing that.
Well, we've heard recently about the establishment of a new federal workforce caucus in Congress. It's bicameral, not fully bipartisan yet, I don't think. But how might you expect that group to act in response to some of the concerns that you've laid out?
I'm glad to see a caucus spin up to kind of dig into federal workforce issues. I do wish it was bipartisan. I don't think that the civil service is something that should be partisan. 80% of federal workers live outside of this area, including large numbers in Texas and Pennsylvania and Florida, these red and blue and purple states, right? I think one thing that this caucus can do is to continue to shine a light on what is happening in the federal workforce. And I think in particular, what we need are stories of agencies that are having a hard time fulfilling their mandates because of a lack of workforce. And I say that truly in a spirit of inquiry. I don't know that is happening everywhere, but I want to know if it's happening. We've heard anecdotes about, let's say, the IRS and some other, and Social Security, about how long, wait times are and things like that seem to be tied to workforce cuts. We need this caucus shining more of a light. But I will say, even last year, right before the inspectors general were fired, there was a bipartisan inspector general caucus that was spun up, and it didn't do very much. I respect that, that individual staffers, might have more or less control over what they do under a caucus. It's a lot about who's in charge. I get that. But the caucus really didn't make much of a peep when, 17 inspectors general representing 18 offices were fired later that week.
So, Faith, you've documented a lot of change in the workforce. You've documented rule breaking. You've documented corruption. But one of the things around government reform, good government groups have been suggesting government reform for years and years and years. And there was always a reason why it couldn't happen: cultural, statutory, regulatory. A lot of those barriers have been eliminated, whether for good or for bad. So now, as people take your feedback and input and others, what should be top of mind for these reform groups who think about building government capacity for the 21st century with 21st century tools?
That's a great question. And I think one thing inherent in that question is we all need to be kind of working together and learning from each other. There are so many great ideas out there and organizations that kind of dive deep into more narrow issues. And I want to know what they think, and they should want to know what Pogo thinks. But in terms of what comes next, I think one big theme to keep in mind is it's not about rebuilding what we had. Because to your point, what we had is no longer functioning in a real way. And specifically, I'm thinking of independent oversight, but, one could kind of apply that to many things. Do we have as strong of a merit-based civil service? Do we have as strong whistleblower protections? So I'm not so much interested in rebuilding what we had 5, 10, 15 years ago. I'm interested in building what is next. I'm interested in leveraging, as you point out, kind of technology to do some of the things that it takes lots of people to do these days. But I'm also, I'm not trying to go back to what was, because those systems were very easily broken.
And what sort of feedback did you get in your shadow testimony? Did you sense that members of Congress were open to this approach?
It's such a good question. I hadn't considered exactly what my response had been. What I heard that day was a group of folks very engaged in this issue, very interested in talking about it and shining a light on it, but it was only half a dozen people. And so I think to your point, I think the caucus is a great next step. I think there are other hearings that need to happen, like full committee hearings that need to happen that kind of talk about these issues. But I do get the sense sometimes that there's a little bit more comfort, let's say, in rebuilding what was versus imagining what's next. But I think that's the job of groups like POGO and other organizations to kind of push our legislators and our policymakers to think a little bit bigger.
I've been speaking with Faith Williams. She's the Director of Effective and Accountable Government Program at the Project on Government Oversight. Faith, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.